A devastating fire in London's richest borough. Its victims, some of the UK's poorest residents. Why didn't Grenfell Tower meet the fire regulations? And are government austerity measures to blame for the tragedy? This is Roundtable with me, Juliet Mann. It's been described as corporate manslaughter. The Grenfell Tower fire swept through the 24-storey building in West London last month with alarming speed. At least 80 people died, but it's believed many more lost their lives that night. Central to the investigation is the building's recent renovation and whether costs had been cut. But was the fire at Grenfell caused by the Conservative government's recent austerity measures? Or was it, as British Prime Minister Theresa May suggests, a result of decades of neglect? Roundtable producer Salahuddin Mazari lives next door to Grenfell, a community united in grief and anger.
I see someone jumping from the window, a child.
We want answers!
There is still hope. We want to keep on to that hope. We don't want to let go of that hope until it's confirmed.
The fire at Grenfell Tower in West London has left the small community devastated.
My name is Salahuddin Mazari, and this is my local community. I grew up here. Friends of mine were caught up in this tragedy, so I recognise a lot of the faces amongst the dead and the missing. The aftermath of the fire has reopened old wounds, old grievances between this impoverished community and a government which locals here feel does not represent them.
Normally hidden from view, they've been thrust into the spotlight. Those who survived are fighting to uncover the truth, and the battle for accountability has only just begun. But many are angry at the system. Years of government cuts that have crippled low-income families. Who really is to blame for Grenfell? Anger is running deep, and it's turning towards the Conservative government.
I think it's telling the extent to which this government boasted about rolling back fire safety and so on, under the guise of cutting red tape, of limiting bureaucracy, and actually what this cutting red tape involved was cutting back on people's safety.
But it's spending cuts that have been at the heart of the government's fiscal policy. After the global financial crisis, it pledged to reduce the national debt. There was a freeze on pay for public sector workers. Local councils looked to save wherever they could. The age of austerity had begun. Now, almost a decade on, and a new UN report says the gap between Britain's rich and poor is wider than ever. Surrounded by wealth, Grenfell residents lived in one of the most deprived neighbourhoods in the country, and 1 in 5 children across the UK don't have enough to eat. But did austerity play a part in the failings that led to the Tower fire?
I mean, it's difficult to say that austerity is to blame as such. It's much, much more nuanced than that. And we're perhaps getting into a debate here which is broader than simply whether we spend more money or not, and really how we value different parts of society.
Kensington and Chelsea Borough, where Grenfell Tower is, had, it turns out, deep pockets, some £270 million in reserves. Money that could have been earmarked for better, safer housing. Why wasn't it? The answer might emerge from the political debate that is now unfolding in this country. Why are the needs of people like those who lived in this tower ignored?
The fire at Grenfell Tower may become a major turning point in British society in the way that people from lower income areas like this one are viewed by the state. Whilst the government definitely has introduced some measures to reassure residents of my local community, they're yet to address deep feelings of mistrust and neglect that have arisen from this tragedy.
Has a rich council let down its poor? Should the finger be pointed at the government and its spending cuts? Well, joining me at today's roundtable is Alma Anwar, a criminal defence lawyer and human rights campaigner. Abby Wilkinson is a writer and journalist. She says that in the face of the Grenfell fire, anger is a moral necessity. To my left is Callum Pickering, a senior economist at Berenberg Bank. And we're also joined by Rob Wilson, a former Conservative MP. He doesn't think that the government's austerity can be linked to the Grenfell fire at all. Abby, I'll start with you. Is austerity to blame for the Grenfell tragedy?
I think it's difficult to say that the council's hand was forced by national government cuts when they decided to, hold money back. They decided to refund council tax. I think Kensington and Chelsea Council kind of had their own austerity mindset that led to a lot of this. There seems to be a sense that they were more interested in refunding money to their rich residents than spending on safe housing for poor people. So in that sense, having
their own austerity mindset, do you agree there that there's one rule for the haves and another for the have-nots?
Well, my position is that many people, many in the Conservative government, have tried to describe this as a tragedy. I think it's a tragedy. I think it's a crime. The people of Grenfell who died because they were poor. And Abby's right in terms of the austerity mindset. When you consider that it would have cost the administration £300,000 to fit sprinklers in that building. Instead, they spent £3 million on cladding it up to gentrify it, make it look good for the luxury flat owners nearby. It would have cost £4,000 to have fire extinguishers in every floor, smoke alarms. When you consider the fact that during Boris Johnson's reign, 552 firefighters were cut, 10 fire stations were cut down, and you have seen a massive reduction in fire prevention safety. And that's been on the basis of austerity cuts. And austerity cuts cost lives. It means deregulation has actually practically meant that people's safety has been jeopardised. The building regulators regime has been cut back. Deregulation actually means putting profit and price before people's safety, and that ultimately meant that people died.
Rob, austerity cuts cost lives.
Well, austerity has become a pejorative term on the left of politics, but all it really means is a government balancing its books. And if you don't balance your books, you create more and more poverty and difficulty for poorer families further down the line as you have to pay off those debts that are created by the money you're spending now. And we had a global banking crisis and a government that overspent for years and years, so that in 2008 we had this massive crash. And we've been left, the Conservative government and the coalition government actually, were left to pick up all the pieces. You can't spend your way out of a crisis.
You still haven't
No, but that's not the point.
No. There were certainly problems with the Labour government pre-2010 that made the conditions that led to the financial crisis worse. But since 2010...
Wasn't it the bankers?
Just please. We followed a very clumsy policy of widespread deregulation and cuts for cuts' sake. There's a much more intelligent way to rebalance the books, so it were. So regulation can be a problem in two ways. Sometimes you can have too little regulation. In the case of the housing, it's absolutely clear that when people's lives are at risk, that's a case for more regulation and more penalties on the people that break the regulation. In other areas, there may be some scope for rolling back regulation.
But you see, that's wrong, because the issue over Grenfell wasn't the fact that there wasn't enough regulation. There was plenty of regulation. It's people couldn't... Well, exactly. People couldn't understand it. If we're going to have a conversation, we need to speak one at a time.
You can't... OK.
Well, you interrupted me.
I've been waiting well. Sorry, I've lost my thoughts now. So you talk about balancing the books, but some costs are non-negotiable. Ensuring that council tenants have a safe place to live is non-negotiable. If we need to balance the books, we need to find that money, whether it's by increasing taxes on people who can afford it, whether it's by doing all the things. And the other thing about the austerity policy is that I think the IMF's chief economist in 2013 said that he thought these excessive cuts actually caused economic damage in the long term, and actually investment. We could have, if we'd invested properly, we could have higher tax intake now, and we could not be facing the problems we currently face. So this idea that this was economically sensible.
So let's talk about this investing properly. I'll bring you back in a moment, Rob.
So, in the case of the UK, there's a good argument to balance the books. That's absolutely clear. But it's not a debt-related argument. The UK is a rich economy. It has its own central bank. Debt is really not a problem. It's a problem for one particular reason. Britain has, over the last 40 years, saved, as an economy, private sector, public sector, households, less and less. And those funds provide the source of funds for investment. So investment has declined. And in turn, that's slowed the rate of economic growth. Now, a good reason to have a balanced budget from a fiscal policy point of view is you don't take the dis-saving from the economy, which limits the investment. But it seems unpractical at the moment to force through austerity, given this kind of modest demand side shock we're seeing from Brexit. So it's much better that government focuses on capital spending, investing in new housing, infrastructure projects, deep sea ports, telecommunication, rather than current spending. And that'll reintroduce capital into the economy and speed the rate of economic growth up. And through faster economic growth, we'll have more taxes so that we can fund the government programmes in healthcare, education.
Why is it that whether it be an economist, a banker, or whether it be a Conservative MP or be an ex-MP, that it's always the poor that have to pay the price in terms of austerity? I remember the global crisis was caused by banking, right? But for some reason, since 2010, it's the poorest in the society, the disabled, the weakest and the most vulnerable that have had to pay the price because of austerity cuts. We haven't seen the richest in this country pay the price. They have got richer and richer. We've seen luxury developers. There seems to be no problem with housing in Kensington, Chelsea, the richest borough in this country, where millionaires, multi-millionaires don't even live in those houses. They're lying empty, but people are waking up with hardly the clothes on their back in the morning, the children not knowing where they are, not knowing where family members they are. We're in the richest country, one of the richest countries in the world. Your Prime Minister declared at the election that this is one of the richest countries in the world, yet for some reason we're acting like a third world nation where we can't even assist those people. And in terms of austerity cuts, why is it that when we praise firefighters, nurses, doctors, police officers, yet they must pay the price for austerity cuts when they weren't responsible for the global crisis? But when you cut firefighters by 11,000 since 2010, then people will pay with their lives.
Yeah, I think that's a sort of detached.
Rob, go on, your turn. Let's talk about
all of this is very emotive and very emotional. But when you actually look at the facts are that many poorer people have been taken out of tax altogether. The highest increase in taxes is on the people who earn the most. Income tax is now at its highest ever level. So we have, as a Conservative government that I was part of, made the changes that were necessary to try and rebalance the taxation system. There's a lot more to do. There's still lots of tax avoidance that we need to, and loopholes that need to close down and things like that. But the idea that austerity is causing fires like Grenfell is just absolute patent nonsense.
Really? You never implemented the recommendations of your government reports. This goes back to 1999, a select committee. Then you had 2009, the Lakenwell fire, which killed 6 people. There was a coroner's inquest that recommended sprinkler systems. You had your government minister, who was the housing minister at the time, Brandon Lewis, and he refused sprinkler systems. What he said was, let's leave it to the landlords to do it. And what he said was, 1 regulation in, 2 regulations out. It was almost a trade-off, as in, well, we'll get rid of 1 regulation, we'll get more. Why not have sprinkler systems? Why deregulate? Why pass it out to private landlords at the cost of lives?
What could the UK government have done differently? What would you have liked to see?
There's this really detached economist way of talking about it, which is we need to reduce current spending. What that actually means is we need to spend less money on the things this country needs to operate and the things people in this country need to live good lives. Reducing current spending is reducing the wages of nurses in real terms. It's making class sizes bigger. It's making housing less safe. It's closing down fire stations. We need to start from the point of thinking about what money do we need, what do we need to spend to meet these essential needs, and how are we going to find the money to do it? Not, this is the amount of money we have to spend, so we're just going to have to cut things and, to hell with what happens to people.
I'm sorry, I've been completely misunderstood.
Don't think so. It's price, profits before people's needs. If you're going to do it purely in economic terms, rather than looking at public decency, public necessity and people's lives, and of course economics at the end of the day is going to win if that's purely the way you're going to focus on it. It's about a rethink. What they said at the end of that package on Grenfell was this, that there needs to be a rethink about how we approach things. The Conservative administration, the Kelsey and Chelsington are trying to
rethink. So what is that rethink? I want to come back to you.
I can repeat my point and say I've just given you a solution to how government can spend more, not spend less. So I've been misunderstood, excuse me. I've just given you a good few minutes. The point is, the government does not create any money for the economy, the private sector does. Government acts to redistribute income from the private sector to where we collectively see it is in our best interests. And there is a good argument to provide quality housing, education and health for the least well-off in society. Unfortunately, we're in a slight predicament at the moment that economic growth is slowing. Now, in order to commit to more spending on those areas, we must find a way to generate more economic growth. So the temporary solution is to focus more on capital spending, even if that means temporary current spending cuts, in order to generate the economic growth. Now, there's another solution.
There's a much longer-term gain.
It's not short-term pain, because what you...
It is if you are poor. It is if you're a nurse. It is if you're a social worker or a council worker.
Let him finish, because he was coming there to the solution to this.
Yes, and I stray away from ad hominem attacks anyway. If you increase the level of capital in the economy, you allow entrepreneurs on whom all our lives depend, come up with the technologies, the solutions to our everyday problems. Over time, those productivity gains help us generate more incomes. The greatest gains in mankind have not come from government-intended programs. They've come from entrepreneurs pursuing the profit that you so duly hate.
The greatest gains in this society don't just come from entrepreneurs. They are ordinary, decent people who lived in Grenfell, who worked day and night to be able to make a life for themselves and for this community. And they are the ones who are still suffering. They are the ones who don't receive the money. They're the ones who don't get fire regulations. They're the ones whose public safety doesn't actually count. Whereas if you went to any luxury hotel... Let me just finish. Luxury block or hotel around Grenfell Towers, you will find sprinkler systems.
He's on your side.
I'm on your side. You're arguing past me. Yeah. Please listen. I am not the typical investment banking economist that is here to say, let's go to laissez-faire capitalism. That's not. So you need to lose that idea and actually listen to what I'm saying to you, because actually we agree. We need to spend more on the areas of society. As a rich country, we must do this. The question is, how do you go about doing it? And as I said right at the start, there are some areas where more regulation is needed, others where less regulation is needed. A clumsy approach to policy where you roll back regulation and simply cut anywhere leads you to a situation where we are now, where economic growth on an annual basis is 1 percentage point lower than it was a decade ago.
Can I just bring that back to
management? You're next. I agree we need the economic stimulus you're talking about. What I disagree with is the idea that cutting current spending is a morally tolerable way to find that money. Like, the state has already been stripped to the bone. The fact is, you know, our biggest outgoings, stuff like pensions, the NHS, like, you know, what we need to be looking at to balance our budget, you know, to get rid of a structural deficit, basically, is to be increasing taxes on certain people. The fact is we have an ageing population, we have an increasing social care budget, and we need to face up to the fact that if we want to care for our pensioners...
This is something that is not just in the UK,
you don't tax and spend your way to wealth. You don't tax and spend your way to prosperity. No. The best way to increase the spending you allocate to those least well off is by creating an economic system which has the safest and most stable and maximum rate of potential growth. British economic policy over the last 30 years has systematically damaged the growth potential of this country. I completely agree. I would prefer to see more spending on health, but we live in a world of constraints. You can't lift yourself off the ground by pulling on your laces.
You cannot cut current spending in the short term to direct money towards capital spending. We can't do that. There's no money to take. Where are you going to take it from? Are you going to take it from our hospitals? Are you going to take it from our schools? Are you going to
of course, building new hospitals is capital spending. Building new schools is capital spending.
You're talking about reducing current spending, which is nurses' wages,
Who's talking about that?
You talked about
let's bring it back to Grenfell. Let's bring it back to Grenfell. And this charge that the Conservative policies led to what happened there.
Well, one of the interesting things is that 5 of the refurbished storey buildings that have been closed are in Camden, and they were reclad in 2006 under the Labour government. And the materials are also found to be flammable. And this is also in North London. And this is also in North London. So the idea this has all happened since 2010 is nonsense. This is part of a long-term systemic failure in the planning and regulation system. Indeed, there was a move also in 2005 when I was in Parliament to change the regulations away from the fire service to local authorities to deal with fire safety in buildings. So again, that was before the coalition government, before the Conservative government. So again, the idea that this is
That's,
all...
that's,
that
can I just say it's not an
excuse. Talk to you about the inquiry. Do you think that, what are you hoping from that? And do you think that that is going to lead to a change?
I think there's real concerns that when Theresa May instantly ordered a public inquiry, there was real concerns that, first of all, what's the terms of reference? And we've already seen valid concerns when the chair of the inquiry says he doesn't think he's going to be able to meet the needs of the Grenfell residents. The second issue, of course, is they have to be central to the inquiry. They have to have legal representation. Third issue, of course, is not just simply to look at the cause of the fire and the regulations, but what is the social context and what's gone on before that. And yes, Rob is right. It's not just the case of the Conservative government's to blame, the Labour government's to blame. But if you want to take it right back, you take it back to 1985 when Margaret Thatcher said 60-minute fire-resistant cladding is no longer required and deregulated it. And so began the bonfire regulations after that. So it needs to look at the whole context. If we're really going to get to the heart of it, and the other issue, of course, is running parallel to that many people are asking the question, why is there not a full-blown, we're told there's a full-blown criminal investigation, but if people have died, if there have been rules that have been broken, if there have been laws that have been broken, that people are expecting to see people arrested, people to be prosecuted quite rightly for corporate manslaughter because people have lost their lives. But we also want to see those suited men. We also want to see those government ministers explain themselves. Why in 2009, after Lakenwell, when 6 people died in Lakenwell, and there was a coroner's inquest, and then there was recommendations that there should be sprinklers installed, why it took a Tory government minister to turn around and say, we don't need sprinklers installed, we'll leave that to the landlords to do that, because we'll have one regulation
that is an unfair characterisation of actually what happened.
And I think on top of that, the public inquiry needs to look at all these issues.
But you talk about a criminal investigation, but nobody has been arrested here. And when we had that terrible tragedy in Bangladesh, people were arrested immediately. I mean, this is a first world developing
That's my concern. It's like we're very quick off the mark often when we look at the third world, where Bangladesh is a good example. And that was the first thing that came to my mind, that where you did see people arrested. It seems to me that what we've done is, and I was speaking earlier on about this in terms of deregulation, people ask the question, well, is this criminal or is it not criminal? The problem is that successive governments have taken this out of criminality. What we should have is criminal sanctions, and whether it be the Conservative government or whether it be a Labour government, any government that comes into power should make criminal sanctions and should stop playing with people's lives and should make it by law that if you break the law, if you not simply have guidelines, because the regulations are gone, what we're dealing with now is guidelines. There should be criminal sanctions. And secondly, if we've learned anything off the back of Hillsborough, then we need the Hillsborough law brought in, where instantaneously any public sector, any organisations that are dealing with issues such as housing should instantaneously have a disclosure rule that they have to provide it, and if they fail to do so, then they should be prosecuted and they should be sent to prison.
Let's look forward now. What could be done now? Looking ahead, what would you like to see? What changes would you like to see for the future?
I hope this would be a wake-up call to all councils that they can't treat social tenants with contempt anymore, because I don't know, what is criminal, what's legal. It's all very confusing. Whether or not they've technically broken the law, those councillors treated those residents with contempt. You had bloggers, the Grenfell Housing Action Group, writing about, they consider their building unsafe. They thought there were all these fire safety risks. They were worried about the work that was being done. They complained to their council. They complained to their management group. They got threatened. They got told to shut up. They got a legal letter from the council saying stop blogging about this, trying to shut them up. It's not.
So what should the Tory government now be doing?
I hope this is a watershed so that communities are empowered to take back control over their own communities. And I think that because of the nature of this and the scale of this particular tragedy, there is an opportunity to do that. So that, for example, local councils across the country, and it doesn't matter where you are, treat certain citizens within their boroughs like second-class citizens. They don't give them choices, they have to take what they get. This is an opportunity for the government to give real choice to those communities on the ground to make their own decisions about their own futures.
So a wake-up call, an opportunity. Let's get the economic perspective.
Well, there's a bridge. There's a slight nuance to this. I give you the kind of plain economics, which often seems a little distasteful in the public eye. One solution could be, as the UK is a rich economy, it has low interest rates which reflect the risk of the government's balance sheet, which is low. The government could go through a period, say 3 to 5 years, of temporarily borrowing more in order to fund capital investment, not to fund increased current spending, but to actively seek to raise the potential rate of economic growth, and then over time you would recapture more taxes and be able to promise more to the programs that need it. But the growth has to come before the increased taxes. Again, you can't tax
rethinking that spending, being more discerning.
Growth is the critical point.
We don't have 3 to 5 years to wait to solve these problems. I agree that we need economic stimulus, and we need to find a way to generate more income overall.
It's a wake-up call. Oh.
I think we need to, if this really is a watershed moment, I hope what you say is sincere, because then what you need to see is profit has to stop being the driving point, because as soon as profit is the incentive, then what it means is greed triumphs and people die on the altar of greed. Enough is enough. We need to see a government immediately. They don't need to wait for 6 months. They don't need to wait for a year. Introduce criminal sanctions. Bring in the Hillsborough Law. Make the rules of disclosure out there that whether it be local authorities, governments, etc. Introduce criminal sanctions so no other person has to die in the manner that people died in Grenfell. And the poor have to stop paying the price for government austerity cuts, because it wasn't the poor that was responsible for the global crisis. It was bankers.
I'm afraid you can't. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our time is sadly up. Well, whether the Grenfell Tower fire was, as opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn said, a result of the disastrous effects of austerity, or was it a collective failing of the many governments that preceded this one? Well, the lesson from this tragedy must be that all people, regardless of their economic situation, deserve a safe place to live. This has been Roundtable with me, Juliette Mann. Thanks for watching.